Okay, I'd like to thank, first of all, Gülru and David and the Aga Khan program for providing this opportunity to me for embarking on a completely new project, which has a new title, as Gülru just mentioned, which is indicative of the major reformulation of my project throughout this year, actually. And I'll come to that in a minute. I'll explain everything. But let me start by a story. Do we turn the lights down a little bit?
Let's keep those little ones on. Just great.
Okay. One of the earliest essays that the Ottoman journalist and writer Ahmet Rasim submitted to Servet-i Fünun, Wealth of Sciences, was the illustrated weekly, was entitled pertinently My Photograph. The short essay was published in the 10th issue of the journal in 1891, the year Ahmet Rasim turned 27. A notoriously prolific literary figure, Rasim belonged to a new generation of professional writer-journalists whose careers were shaped by the burgeoning printing industry in the Ottoman capital, catering to the diversified demands of an expanding reading public. As opposed to his mentor, Ahmet Mithat Efendi, who rose to stardom as the fiction factory of his age, Ahmet Rasim remained an adherent of journalistic prose and excelled as a writer of short essays. He transformed the new genre called city letters, to which I will return, where he captured the fleeting moments of everyday life in the city, becoming the most astute chronicler of the multiple encounters, pleasures, profanities, and incongruities of modern life in Istanbul. In his essay on photography, Ahmet Rasim not only revisits the moment his image was captured on the sensitized surface of the photographic plate, but also the moment of his intense encounter with the final product, the print. Testifying to the broader meaning and import of photography that transcends the purely aesthetic qualities of that portable object of display called the photograph, his account captures the entire drama, the full performative dimension of the event of photography that begins, in this case, with a somewhat tense encounter in the studio, in a day Rasim was immersed in deep, worrisome thoughts. And I'm quoting. I stood in front of the camera, my mind taken by the humdrum of life, velvele-i hayat, restlessly trying to fixate my eyes on a fleeting dream, as the photographer struggled, forcing me to fit into a pose suited to his taste, and as I struggled to put my thoughts in order, a voice resounded, "Ready?" A split second of my material existence left its dense shadow on the glass. And 15 days later, there was a long line for development, I owned an object of spectacle that was supposed to bear an exact resemblance to my facial appearance. This, purportedly, was me. Bu ben imişim, dubitative. Taking the photograph in his hand, Ahmet Rasim experiences a true Roland Barthes moment and meditates on the magical power of photography as it preserves an earlier time in the present in the form of an indexical trace, a photochemical imprint. This is what Roland Barthes calls the photographs that has been quality. It's very temporal ambiguity. It is not the image's likeness, its mimetic power, or its aesthetic quality that strikes Ahmet Rasim. He simply marvels at the way a tiny segment of life, that particular moment of disquietude and immersion, was detached from the inchoate flow of being and made a distinct, decipherable, and lasting object of observation. Now, I searched the other issues of Servet-i Fünun hopelessly to find a follow-up article on the next phase of the story, when Ahmet Rasim's private moment of discomfort becomes a mass commodity, as the portrait in question is published in magazines and circulated in the form of celebrity postcards. And alas, the article, of course, wasn't there. Sometimes your historical actors don't cooperate. So I will have to spare you the Walter Benjamin moment in Ahmet Rasim's encounter with his photograph as an object of mechanical reproduction. Nevertheless, even without the sequel, Ahmet Rasim's open-ended engagement with his photograph is indicative of the very protean nature of photography as a fluid and revolutionary medium that has an entirely different ontological status from all previous forms of visual representation. It is a mass-produced and massively accessible visual medium with aesthetic appeal, but also a strong indexical claim to reality. Walter Benjamin calls this the way photography is seared by reality. Ahmet Rasim's essay inspires us to reflect upon the multiple conjunctions between the photographic apparatus, its operator, the photograph's subjects, and its multiple audiences. His insight reminds us that confining the photographic image to the niche of the aesthetic, bounded by traditional art historical paradigms, dissociates it from the messiness of the hybrid modern multimedia environment and from the multiple processes of production, storage, reproduction, and dissemination that constitute the essential and the very densely entwined context of the photographic experience itself. Which brings me back, finally, to the question of the revised title and the changing direction of my project. My initial proposal for this year involved a network approach to photographic practices in the Ottoman Empire. My intention actually was to focus on the agency of cosmopolitan actors in the photography scene and address their mediating role in the formation of a new, globally connected and largely image-based public culture in the Ottoman domain. And then I decided to start by surveying late Ottoman newspapers and journals for gathering evidence on the professional and artistic networks, employing the established historical strategy called pillaging. But as I leafed through the collections, as you can guess, the printed material itself turned into the central object of my inquiry. And my project's focus shifted from the agency of the photographic actors to the agency of the media, more particularly the illustrated journals of the 1890s and 1900s. And there was a worldwide boom in the production of these journals that coincided actually with a period of intense change in network communication. The end of the 19th century was a period that brought dramatic changes in the economy of the written word and that of the image. This was a time that marked the incipient beginnings of the age of modern mass media, when the hegemony of print was diluted with the onslaught of the image, a time when the camera was emancipated from the tripod, becoming a massively accessible mobile device with the advent of the portable Kodak in 1888. Hence the term Kodak Galaxy in my title, where in homage to media historian, actually the patron saint of media studies, Marshall McLuhan's book, The Gutenberg Galaxy of 1962, where he investigates the foundational impact of mechanized printing on human consciousness. In their hybrid and wildly eclectic format, the illustrated journals of this period brought together a dynamic assemblage of textual and visual information, mixing authorial voices with multiple techniques of mechanized imaging in order to attune their readers to the modern world and provide the sense of a shared and changing present. In a seminal article entitled "There Are No Visual Media," art historian W.J.T. Mitchell interrogates the modernist utopian urge to isolate and purify visual representation as a separate category. Informed by the work of media theorists, McLuhan again, he makes a case for the intense heterogeneousness of all representation and declares that all media actually is mixed media. The visual, he claims, has always been nested in and braided with other forms of media, textual, oral, tactile, and so on. And he uses media in the sense of all vehicles used for externalizing human thought, including language. Drawing upon Mitchell's alternative media taxonomy, I intend to study photography, the product of an age of multimedia explosion, as part of a broad and hybrid regime of representation. Rather than approaching the Ottoman photographic material as discrete objects of pure aesthetic and connoisseurial interest, harvested according to need from the collector's universe, or taking them as confirmatory evidence of all-pervading ideologies like empire and Orientalism, I intend to follow and historicize the traces of these images in the context of infinite quotidian reproducibility, as they were produced, redeployed, collated with texts, and disseminated in the pages of the illustrated journals. I propose to see these images as the product of changing medial practices and protocols, a new and modern regime of mediation, if you will, that extended from the Hamidian archive and gift albums to newspaper causerie, snapshots, postcards, illustrated textbooks, and dime novels. The mechanically reproduced images in question demanded new systems of value and new rhetorical strategies in the course of their deployment. And as they were spilled out in the Ottoman domain, they signaled the rise of a changing experience of reading texts and images, and reading them together, of course. The way photography was intermeshed with a multiplicity of other media in the Ottoman domain was obviously part and parcel of a far-reaching transformation of global scale. The heavily image-centered information revolution of the 19th century, as the historian Terry Cochrane argues in his Twilight of the Literary, brought forward new modes in which, I'm quoting, human thought was transcribed and materially registered, irrevocably altering visions of historical continuity. The adoption of a broad, global perspective in the analysis of photographs based on an awareness of how human agency operates in conversation with a technomaterial universe allows us to diminish the overwhelming weight of auteurism that characterizes studies of Ottoman photography. A good deal of energy has been spent in recent years in distinguishing the individual styles of Ottoman photographers like Sebah or Ali Sami, or that of their patrons, such as Abdul Hamid, the presumed mastermind behind the monumental project of imperial self-representation called the Albums. Such formalist inquiry is congruent with a broader quest for identifying a collective local perspective in the domain of Ottoman photography. It is assumed that the study of the works of locally trained photographers would reveal a distinct indigenous approach to photography that was informed by the particular conditions and pre-existing visual traditions of that locality. This is what Christopher Pinney, historian of photography in India, calls the native eye syndrome, a condition that ails studies of photography through the non-Western world. No scholar with the right mind makes an effort to distinguish a British eye that predetermines the way images are organized within the photographic frame in the British Isles. The Ottoman case, on the other hand, is expected to be distinguished from the core history of photography, which is a Western domain, through its autochthonous, localized features. In an article published in History of Photography, for instance, Michelle Woodward contrasts the photographs of Sebah, a local Ottoman photographer, with those of Bonfi, a foreigner, to single out what she calls a community portrait style that pervades the works of Ottoman photographers, particularly Sebah. And this is supposedly a less intrusive kind of outlook that is more perceptive to the realities of an active social life in the Ottoman domain. And she compares photographs, okay, it's time for my pointer, like these, where this is a Sebah picture, and this is a Bonfi photograph. In the Sebah photograph, you have direct eye contact with the subjects, whereas in the, let me show you another example, again, Sebah and Bonfi. Again, eye contact, direct eye contact, and order and rationality, whereas the Bonfi example brackets this Jerusalem shopkeeper as a type, as a representative of a type. But we can simply extract a different pairing from the constellation of free-flowing images available to the researcher. Again, Sebah to the left, and this time Bonfi to the right. And conclude that Sebah, a cosmopolitan subject with multiple allegiances, was actually a die-hard Orientalist. Here, I think we have to remember Febvre and Martin's warning in the coming of the book about the impact of print in early modern Europe, that publishers were, above all, driven by profit. And Sebah, who teamed up with a Frenchman, Joaillier, had studios to maintain and catered to a diversified audience that ranged from the Sultan to the ordinary tourist. Yeah, I think I made my point. So why did I put this? I don't know. This is like, again, a comparison of Berggren photograph, Swedish photographer, and this is Kevork Abdullah. And from within a formalist perspective, I don't see any way you can distinguish between these two images. So I propose to distinguish the particularities of photography in the Ottoman Empire, not through exclusive recourse to aesthetic criteria, but with reference to a broader and variegated environment of medial production, dissemination, and reception. The life of the individual photograph was indexed to the everyday realities of a market, which resonated with a vibrant print culture, with changing technological practices in visual production, and with the changing modalities of political control. And I kind of hope to use the illustrated journals as a basis to find my way around in this labyrinthine world. The Ottoman illustrated journals date back to the 1860s. The first publications that defined themselves as Ottoman illustrated weeklies were Istanbul, 1867, and Musavver Medeniyet, Illustrated Civilization, it was published through the year 1874. These pioneering journals were adorned with elaborate woodcut images of statesmen, monuments, archaeological finds, and European paintings. Some of these images were locally produced by Ottoman craftsmen, while others were imported, and there was a good deal of circulation of used prints, some of them very worn out, people complain, that come from France. And when you didn't have access to these, few good Ottoman craftsmen or the French prints, you had to go to the stamp makers and have a really, really crude woodcut to fill your page. Although there were other experiments in combining imagery and typescript in popular Ottoman press, the golden age of the illustrated journal starts in the 1890s with the publication of several weeklies, including Marif, Education, Servet-i Fünun, Malumat, Information, and Musavver Cihan, Illustrated Universe. There was fierce competition among the publishers of these journals, involving heavy doses of journalistic wrangling, pirating. Many articles were stolen, and this guy was responsible for most of these, this notorious Mehmet Tahir, also known as Baba Tahir, who had very close connections to the palace, as well as outright slander and espionage. And the Servet-i Fünun was actually closed down for a while in 1901 because the editor of Malumat, the mouthpiece of the Hamidian regime, Tahir, again, filed an incriminating report to the palace. This was called, during the Hamidian era, a journal, a kind of spy report. So what I'm trying to understand is this hybrid intermedial mixed media network that connects the journal to the journals, if you will. So this was the case of Baba Tahir, as you can see. He was heftily decorated by the palace, but then he was, he was also working as a counterfeiter using his connections to the palace. He was publishing articles in his journal about medals being given to certain foreign officials, which weren't actually given by the palace. And he counterfeited these medals and sold them to the foreign officials and made a lot of money. And so the story doesn't end. The rise of the Ottoman Illustrated Journal was concomitant to the rapid increase in literacy across the empire due to Abdülhamid's far-reaching campaign on modernized education. Although exact data on literacy is lacking in the Ottoman case, we can safely assume that the overall figures for the imperial conglomerate were, at the end of the century, in the single-digit level. And there are conflicting estimates about Istanbul, but this was broadly the case. Nevertheless, scholars agree that there was a steep rise in Ottoman literacy levels between 1876 and 1909. The Hamidian era, in other words, produced a vibrant print industry catering to a wider reading public with changing reading practices, shifting tastes, and diversified demands. Thanks to the advances in print technology, and at this point you have the introduction of power-driven rotary machines, the lush, visually alluring weeklies became an affordable commodity across the empire. The Malumat and the Servet-i Fünun sold for 100 paras, which wasn't that much actually. That was what you would pay for a very modest lunch in the old part of Istanbul. Not too bad. As for the sales figures, the Servet-i Fünun was able to reach the mid-2000s at the end of the century, and subscribers in the provinces constituted half of this number, which is quite impressive. And alongside Servet-i Fünun, at this point, we have about 6 other weeklies that are in circulation. And alongside these numbers, of course, we need to remember that there are oral and collective reading practices. You have the emergence of the reading rooms called kıraathanes, and Serafim's kıraathane, for instance, was the most notable. And it held all copies of these circulating journals and newspapers. Just like the camera and the bicycle, the illustrated journal was considered a patent sign of modernity. In the customary expression of intent articles published at the beginning of each year, the editors of the journals affirmed repeatedly that the real driving force of this new medium was the circulating image, printed on the page through advanced reproduction technologies. The Ottoman weeklies were born into the so-called photomechanical revolution, where multiple new photorelief technologies, collectively called the process in press jargon, enabled the faster, cheaper, and more accurate transfer of images on the page. The most common technique used in Ottoman publishing was wood engraving, and that's the one on the right, which is different from woodcut, actually. It's much faster and more precise than the woodcut. And there was a high demand for engravers in Istanbul, to the point that the School of Fine Arts opened a whole department on engraving, specialized on engraving. The other more advanced technology was zincography, the one on the left, where images were projected on a chemically sensitized plate and then etched and refined by hand. This was also practiced in Istanbul, but most copies were sent to the so-called Zinco factories in Vienna because it was cheaper. It took like, if you had a photograph in your hand, you would send it by train, and in 3 days you would get your zinc plate, which was ready for publication. One crucial point in terms of the materiality of the photographic image and its actually indexical status is that even the most advanced process techniques, like the halftone, involved heavy intervention of the human hand. And it's hard to believe, but all of these photographs that you see on the screen, taken from the newspapers, are actually handmade. They're handcrafted. Although based on photographs, in reality, these images were largely handmade translations of the indexical original that were finely crafted to provide the illusion of direct transcription. This was actually also true for studio photography, where there was heavy retouching going on. I was looking through Ottoman manuals for photography from this period, and they all have huge chapters about painting and retouching photographs. And there were whole teams of people in the studios working on the photographs, basically. So these people were basically the first Photoshop generation, maybe. So these were the techno-material basics of image processing in Europe and the Ottoman world. But what distinguished the Ottoman journals from their European counterparts in terms of their photo imaging preferences was their unflinching demand for veracity. And on the left, Adam, this is for you. On the left is the owner of the popular Ottoman theater called Gülünçhane, Abdi Efendi. And on the right, you see a contemporary example from England. Okay, so the Ottoman imaging preferences. Even with the advanced technologies, the painterly touch maintained its presence and status in the pages of the European weeklies. A large proportion of the images that were transferred from photographs carried the artist's intentional marks of translation, evoking the sense of prestige associated with academic painting. The Ottomans, on the other hand, in their usual pragmatism, privileged the informative value of the photograph and demanded full veristic transcriptions. Art reproductions were a different issue, but when it came to photographs, they made every effort to make sure that they looked like photographs. The Ottoman illustrated weeklies were modeled after their European precursors like L'Illustration or Le Monde Illustré, which were all modeled after the Illustrated London News, which started publication in 1842. As opposed to the heavier opinion-based format of the newspapers and periodicals of the earlier decades, illustrated journals of the 1890s epitomized the so-called new journalism of the end of the century. Employing a highly visualized, dynamic format, these publications were designed both to inform and to entertain. They were sites of universal observation, catering to the demands of a bourgeois culture of comfort. They provided a broad perspective of the changing everyday world with lushly illustrated pages, marinated with an eclectic mix of chatter, commentary, gossip, and literary fragments. Historians of Ottoman publishing often sneer at the fragmentary and eclectic format of Ottoman illustrated journals. They take the array of disjointed texts and photographs to be a sign of the ineptitude or ignorance of the editors, while, in fact, this very fragmentation lay at the heart of the organizational logic of the illustrated journal as a modern medium. Many European journals of this period actually made recurring use of detached, unrelated imagery called fillers as visual teasers or human interest objects. So there was no escape, although I didn't put an example, there was no escape from the occasional human-shaped turnip or potato. It would just come back again and again. But other images did relate to texts, maybe not directly or adjacently, but in an extended process of reiteration and seriality. And on the right, you see in one issue of the Servet-i Fünun these images from Yemen that have no connection to the texts in that issue, but a couple of issues later, we learn that it's an Ottoman traveler who is actually a correspondent to the magazine who travels from Baghdad to Yemen and writes this travelogue, and they, all the photographs are interspersed in the different issues. As objects of both immediate and serial consumption, the illustrated journals demanded a new practice of reading and a new modality of relating texts and images. In the Ottoman case, this unconventional image-text nexus gave rise to new literary experiments in a classical rhetorical form, ekphrasis, the literary description of visual imagery. In the pages of Servet-i Fünun, in particular, young literary celebrities like Tevfik Fikret conducted new experiments in literary description by translating pictorial or photographic images into prose or verse. In some cases, the journals organized the, before passing, this is, for instance, a poem written by Tevfik Fikret, who was also a painter himself, so most probably this is one of his paintings. In some cases, the journals organized public literary competitions, inviting their readers to be inspired by a provided image. This is the competition called The Sleeping Child, Tıflı Naim. And the winning entries are here on the left side. Servet-i Fünun's lead in this literary channel was not coincidental. Starting out as a standard illustrated chronicle, the journal turned in the mid-90s into the eponymous home of a new literary movement. Young writers of the Servet-i Fünun school, like Tevfik Fikret, brought a strong introspective depth to Ottoman literature and introduced a realistic descriptive style that carried a strong visual charge. The politically subdued, mellow bourgeois tone of the illustrated journal was a perfect match for the Hamidian regime, marked by strong authoritarian rule and a severe control of media practices. The Sultan himself was an ardent follower of illustrated journals from home and abroad, which constituted a part of the Yıldız Palace archives. As a firm believer in the power of the circulating images, he occasionally pressured the editors of the journals to publish images he clipped from foreign journals. For instance, in the 90s again, as Armenians were being massacred in eastern Anatolia, the journals documented the glories of the Oriental Hamidiye regiments, coupled, and I'm sparing you the image, coupled by the curious image of a black man lynched by an American mob, courtesy of the Sultan. And you know, this is the usual European double standards. What are they talking about? The Hamidian archive comprised a hybrid melange of official correspondence and visual information, ranging from mugshots to monuments, collected, collated, commissioned or received as gifts, and circulated in the press. Oh, I'm sorry, something happened to this slide. The kids seem to have vanished. Poor kids, this is the orphanage. I'm not the orphanage, the deaf and blind school, and no luck here either, sorry. The organizational logic of the archive overlapped with that of the illustrated journal. In fact, there were no clear boundaries between the two domains as sites of observation and engagement with the empire and the wider world. Abdülhamid's photography collection, part of this archival conglomerate, carried no unity or autonomy. It was part and parcel of the universe of circulating images and information. And in fact, the gift albums that were sent to the Library of Congress and the British Library came alongside cases of books, publications, almanacs, illustrated textbooks, and so on and so forth. It was part of this package. The Hamidian ruling apparatus was therefore not the main purveyor of images, nor was it the sole arbiter of modes of imperial identification. So Abdülhamid was not an auteur. The pages of the illustrated press reveal that the Ottoman readers were not passive recipients of imperial ideology. They formed an urban, Turkish-speaking, privileged, interpretive community, which was, in the words of Benedict Anderson, bound together by the common experience of reading. For the first time, this core community perceived itself as part of the broader picture of the empire in such palpable visual form. Involving a good deal of reader participation, the journals provided an interactive ground which portrayed the modern Ottoman urban crowd to itself, replete with its embedded hierarchies, anxieties, alteritisms, and so on. Reports, travel diaries, and photographs by journal correspondents intermingled with letters and photographs sent by mid-rank officials, teachers, provincial notables, and progressive mullahs, providing a cumulative and eclectic sense of empire that is reciprocated by the Hamidian albums. This one on the left is one of my favorites. Actually, this is sent by a grandee from a small town in the Aydın province in the Aegean, and he basically donates some money to the navy, and this is to be documented in the newspaper. And here in the image you see this whole charged atmosphere of the photographic event, where he made all this effort to bring together probably his daughter or granddaughter, his little model ship, a figurine, I think part of a water pipe, his calligraphy collection, his birds, everything is there. So the reader, just like the Sultan, was a synthesizer of the empire's fragments, engaged in a modern form of contemplation that the media historian Gary Began calls fragmentary mapping. And again, two examples from the journals. The one on the left conforms more to your standard sterilized Hamidian album format, but then you have all of these other images of infrastructure and development and progress that are sent by people that also include a very strong human element. I also need to mention that the broader range of Hamidian photographs in the collection also include some pictures that have this snapshot quality. The Ottoman illustrated journals help us populate the idea of empire as it was conceived at its core. But the sense of a shared present was offered most vividly through visions of the imperial capital, as they were articulated in the novel genre of city letters. Oh, no, not there yet, sorry. Inspired by the Metropolitan News or Courrier de Paris sections of European journals, the city letters were personal freestyle essays by the editor, or most of the time by the special letter writer, city letter writer of the journal. Combining reportage with an intimate conversational tone, the letters recounted the encounters of the writer as he constantly wandered in a spatially and socially segregated urban landscape. Earlier examples of the city letters from the 1870s carry a stronger critical tone, providing satirical visions of corruption, municipal mismanagement, congestion, pollution, and all other agonies of insufficient modernization. There was always this weighing of Istanbul as an urban conglomerate with the examples in Western Europe. With the Hamidian era, the satirical tone is replaced by the purely descriptive, taking at its center the transitory, prosaic, and commonplace realities of everyday life. Although the conversational tone, musahebe it is called, of these articles is closely resonant with local literary traditions, the delineation of urban types and settings in the letters comes with a largely subdued moral message. And these are the, again, we're talking about this fragmentary text-image universe, so these are not necessarily the images that accompany the city letters, but nevertheless, they do talk about same kinds of situations and types. My favorite being the decadent, here on the very right, and the guys at the Malumat journal called the Servet-i Fünun people decadans, and they even composed a song for it, decadan, decadan, dan, 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 kind of thing. Writers like Ahmet Rasim constantly straddle between, just one more example that accompanies the city letters. There are all these types, real people that are being discussed in the city letters. And then interspersed in different issues, you see pictures of these people. One of them being Cüce Hayati, Hayati the dwarf, who is from Salonika, and he's this incredibly witty and sometimes malicious figure. It's a favorite of the press scene in Istanbul, and he comes up, all the time in the articles. And then sometimes also he's put in this is him holding an issue of Servet-i Fünun. This is him as the cover of Malumat magazine. On the top right corner, you see Petraki, the owner of the Crystal Casino. And the city letter writers talk all the time about going to Crystal. They're broke, they don't have money. They ask for cucumber. The cucumber costs 5 kurush, and it's ridiculous, and so on. And here is a whole body of characters. The left, we're supposed to know from the Kağıthane promenades. He's a seller of nuts, Kör Hasan, I think. And on the very right is a guy that they call, is a person that they call the Diogenes of the period. Again, an incredibly witty figure who is a porter, actually, but who hangs out with all these city letter writers. Anyway. Writers like Ahmet Rasim constantly straddle between older and newer ways of spending time and money in the city. More interested in capturing the everyday rhythm of the urban crowd, they transcribe the full social charge of the urban encounter, not sparing any detail of its mundane, corporeal expressions, from fez tilting and mustache wriggling to pinching, spitting, and poking with a needle or an umbrella. Like the man of the crowd in Baudelaire's Painter of Modern Life, instantly moving through the city, the letter writer defines himself as a mobile reporter. And the term they use is seyyar muhabir, mobile reporter, who roams about the streets. And they use the term sürtmek, where basically, I don't know if roaming about is the equivalent, but it's kind of slang. Roams about the streets, public gardens, promenades, cafes, theaters, and vaudeville joints of Istanbul, producing a shared knowledge of the urban present and making the urban aggregate knowable and navigable. And it was no coincidence that the first issue of Malumat came with a complimentary Istanbul map. The Malumat group also, the editor, half-jokingly talks about himself as a mobile reporter, but then there's a cyclist reporter as well. Again, even more mobile, velosipedli muharrir. And then at some point, really, this reporter, or the cyclist reporter, starts recounting his experiences as he's going around the city with his bike. The camera eye of the letter writer is complemented by the snapshot photographs dispersed in the journal pages. And there's a lot of, as I said, after the Kodak portable camera, it was the journals encouraged their readers to send their snapshots, which were called in traditional Ottoman instantane. So these fragments of urban life that were captured by enthusiasts of photography did constitute, I think, a visual counterpart to the city letters themselves. And there were even competitions, instantane snapshot competitions, to which over 100 enthusiasts joined. And then this, I think, the one to the right was the winner in 1896, the Fenerbahçe stream. And complementing the snapshots, actually, was the sketch that emerged as a legitimate art form at the end of the 19th century. And I don't have much time to talk about this, but what you see on the screen is this face of a soldier by Osman Hamdi Bey that was published in Servet-i Fünun. And this is Hoca Ali Riza, one of the most important painters of the period, and his sketches. And Ali Riza had this real antiquarian urge to capture the vanishing moments of everyday life in Istanbul. He had this very bourgeois appreciation of the commonplace, which was conversant, of course, with the sensibilities of the city letter writers. Almost done. Istanbul had its charms, surely, but it also had an underbelly. Alongside the zippy snapshots, the pages of Ottoman illustrated journals were also peppered by stories of crime and urban violence. Crime stories, the gruesome and the macabre, were a staple of popular press coverage across the world, of course, but the Ottoman case had its peculiarities. Almost all crime stories that I surveyed in these journals involve lower-class, non-Muslim subjects. They reveal a diverse compendium of low-born Christian Stambuliots, from prostitutes, porters, and peddlers to apprentices, cooks, and their mistresses. The one here, Spiro, the cook, he's a cook in one of the Beyoğlu Pera restaurants, and he kills his mistress. So he's presented as Spiro the villain. This one, I think, anyway, let me move on to another example. Agop, the apprentice who works in a carpenter shop, kills his master for money. And then to fool the authorities, he mutilates himself. He actually slashes his penis and then has himself tied up. But then, the police catch him and they make him reanimate the scene. And that's the photograph provided by the police authorities, of course. There's an unvarying narrative order to these appalling tales as they're fleshed out in the pages of the journals. The mysteries are triumphantly solved by the police forces, and the culprits invariably confess to their crimes. These narratives are not only meant to glorify the modern Ottoman state apparatus, they help compartmentalize and reconfirm social and ethno-religious cleavages for a privileged Muslim readership, while also allaying their anxieties about living in a changing and fragmented urban landscape. And perhaps one could go even further at this point and argue, alongside the critic of modern Turkish culture, Nurdan Gürbilek, that periods of severe political oppression and control breed their alternative and often grotesque public channels for the indirect expression of collective frustration and angst. During the Hamidian era, death and violence found their way into the illustrated journals only in the shape of apolitical, mundane, and alteritized spectacle, or inevitably as the object of crude propaganda. But still, I think one should not underestimate the political power of the circulating image and the potential it holds for open, independent scrutiny. The journal's unruly, fragmented format, bringing together pashas and potatoes, the solemn and the carnivalesque, its serial reiteration and remediation of images, and its broad interactive capacity allowed the readers to engage with its contents in complex and unforeseeable ways. This potential for open engagement was further enhanced and complicated by the power of the camera, with its unrestrained openness to reality, its ability to expand a moment beyond the capacity of the naked eye, and beyond the intentions of its operator. And with this, I give the final word to Ahmet Rasim, looking at his picture again. And this is what he says. Looking at my photograph, I further appreciate the value of life, because that split-second reflection of life's shadow expands a moment of emotion, whose intellectual import now equals a century's worth of events. Thank you. Should I take the questions? Okay, no questions without the light. Now, Johan. Yes.
Sorry, I know nothing about any of this, but I work on journals in India. So
Mm. Yeah.
provinces, and I wondered if you have any sense
Yeah.
from their letters,
Mhm.
how the city photographs were perceived in the provinces. You know, the kind of
Mhm.
something that is real for maybe for the city becomes something
Yeah.
phantasmagoric
Mm.
if it's not part of your life, and the other way around. You know, for
Right.
the photographs of the
Mhm.
provinces for city readers.
Right. Yeah. I do have a sense, and my sense is that actually all of these subscribers, like for Servet-i Fünun, at least we're talking about a bit more than 1,000 people, were connected to Istanbul somehow through the Ottoman official network. There were either teachers, officials, army officers, and so on, who were either from Istanbul or who had been there for education. So for instance, I remember the case of this teacher in Van, which is really to the east of Anatolia, quite far away from Istanbul. And in his letter, which also has photographs of the native types, I couldn't figure out whether he was actually from Van or not, but he says that every week, the best moment of the week is the time when the Servet-i Fünun arrives. He opens its pages and then sniffs the atmosphere of Istanbul. Revisiting basically all the sites that he's familiar with. So this was a kind of mode of reconnecting to Istanbul. The other part of the story, I really have no idea whether people who did not have much connection to Istanbul, how they perceived the images of Istanbul, whether Istanbul became a celebrity at this point because of the media industry, the way it is now with the TV series, and then people flock to Istanbul to see the scenes, whether that kind of effect was in play at that point, whether Istanbul became a marketable commodity, a tourist commodity because of the journal readership, I as yet have no idea. Yes, David.
Hey, thank you. At the beginning you started with the sort of maybe as a kind of a counter to tendencies in the field of the history of photography. You started with this idea of hybridity and intermediality.
Yes.
Basic conditions for looking at printed materials and this easy sort of transit between and across media that takes place in the second half of the 19th century. But then at a later point in the talk you seem to reinstate the idea of a kind of a medium specificity in contrasting the photographic images that appeared in Servet-i Fünun and things like the Illustrated London News or Punch, where the sort of the, I don't know, painterly qualities,
Mm-hmm.
the hand-related qualities that one would associate with pen and drawing seem to be more fully visible. So it was, and then I guess later in the talk you also started to introduce things like the sketch
Right.
and other images which show a pretty, or suggest a broad variety of the kinds of images.
Uh-huh.
So I wonder if you could just clarify
Right.
that point.
Yeah, if I understood your question correctly, my emphasis on photography has to be counterbalanced, you're saying, with the other kinds of.
You've moved away from
Right.
an intermediate
Mm-hmm.
condition to reinstating a medium specificity
Hmm.
and contrasting what happens with photographs
Right. Mm-hmm.
in Servet-i Fünun versus what happens with.
Okay. Uh-huh. Well, that wasn't my intention. No, I'm trying to understand, and maybe it's because at this point I'm immersed in reading these magazines that I'm, just focused on this part of the story, trying to understand how it works, the whole techno-material universe that surrounds it. But eventually, what I hope to understand is how these different forms of visual and textual representation emerge, come together. They are recollated, reiterated, and they are juxtaposed in unforeseeable ways. This is basically the scope of the project. And if the impression was more on, the journal and its use of photography, that.
You started to talk about the zincographs. And another question, at some point you showed an image of, there's a guy with, who had print in front of him set up in,
Yes, yes. Uh-huh.
I don't know what that thing is called.
Uh-huh.
I guess the printer's furniture, right? But, and the article seemed to be dealing with the history of print. So there's a
A, could you reformulate that? I'm not sure I got you.
In the midst of this, the use of these new technologies of reproduction, is it also the case that the history of mechanical reproduction as a subject?
You're talking about that period.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. I mean, there is an amazing wealth of material in all of these journals, and I've, surveyed about 7, 8 of them so far. And there are long articles about history of printing, not only new technologies, so there's a lot of that, but also the whole quote-unquote Gutenberg galaxy and how it was received in the Ottoman Empire. This is definitely part of a new interest. Yes, Zeynep.
I was noticing that you're comparing, sort of characterizing an Ottoman in relation to European publications, and I was kind of wondering if in the long run in your project, you're also going to look at the Ottoman print universe in other cities like Salonika and Smyrna, which also had their own and somewhat autonomous print worlds, and that might actually allow you to delineate something that is more characteristic of Ottoman
I hope not actually. I hope that I find some variety, and this is still the very early stages of this project. But what I've tried to do is I went through some Karaman Lidika stuff material that they have in the Widener, which is really sad because this material actually was put in the garbage by the Ankara National Library. And now the material slowly is finding its way through dealers into Widener. And pamphlets like this are being marketed for like thousands of dollars. Anyway, that's like behind the scenes. But what I've been trying to do is to look through this Karaman Lidika material, Turkish and Greek script, and trying to find connections. But I don't feel comfortable talking about this as yet. There's a whole universe, not only in Salonika and Izmir, but also in the Arab-speaking lands, especially Syria. And then of course, the Egyptian connection, if you're talking about Syria, that, we have people like Georgi Zaidan, the publisher whose newspaper sells like about 200,000 in the Arab-speaking world. That's a really, really serious number. So there's that whole universe, which I'm obviously not able to go into, but I'll try to look at specific comparative cases, especially as regards the core of Ottoman Empire, the core 3 cities, Istanbul, Salonika, and Izmir, but also different communities, Armenian, the whole Judo-Spanish, Armeno-Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Bulgarian presses, at least to have a sense of their, maybe I won't be able to penetrate because of the language barrier, but at least in terms of their format, their use of technology, I hope to be able to have this comparative perspective. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for that talk. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I have sort of 2 questions, one on materiality and the other one on text and image relationship. And the first question actually sort of relates to what David was asking about media. And I really appreciate your effort to sort of address the agency of media in this multimedia context. And I was thinking about when you're sort of describing the printing technology and that's with graving, which graving technique I never known about, and I would be delighted to learn more about it. But I was thinking about the base, the paper, because photographic prints like these would have different paper quality than illustrated journals and magazines, and also that would be different from books that are printed with this similar technology. And not only the qualities of the original plate would have something to do, some impact on how they would appear, but also the quality of paper that they're using probably will, I mean, since you have handled them so much, I wonder
Mm.
what kind of objects they are actually,
Mhm.
in terms of sort of day-to-day circulation in relation
Yeah.
to photographic image like that and printed books and
Mhm.
such. So that's one question.
Right.
And another one is, it's more of a comment that it struck me how there are so many labels in images, like photographic images, and when you were sort of talking about the fragmentary nature of text-image relationship in these magazines, nonetheless there are so many affirming labels and
Mhm.
language politics in a way
Mhm.
that sort of, because I only can read
Yes.
French, that I, it's just passed out to me, and that's in a way sort of affirming that your sort of claim about veracity that's emphasized in these images.
Mm.
And I think it actually would be
Yeah.
interesting to think about,
Mm.
because that's very direct in terms of text and image relationship.
That's true. That's
So-
true. Sometimes they don't have captions, too.
Right.
I have to confess, but there's a whole politics of language behind that, as you said, and some of you might have realized that the malumat issues, at least pictures taken from the malumat, have 3 languages: Turkish, Arabic, and French. And malumat, because it was government sponsored, had this policy of publishing supplements, and they had 2 supplements, one for women and one for Arabs. Yeah, so an Arabic version was provided, and each caption had to have an Arabic translation. And
How different were the versions?
pardon?
How different were the versions of women for women and Arabs?
Oh, that was just a supplement of 2 pages. So they would have special articles about women's lives, the women's movement, fashion, mostly written by women authors, Ottoman women authors. Yeah, and the paper. This is the period actually when paper really got cheap, much cheaper, because they started using pulp. And the Ottomans were not able, both able to produce the paper used for, publishing these photographic images, but also, for quite reasonable prices, import them. So the owner of the Servet-i Fünun, Ahmet Ihsan, actually goes to France and visits all of the factories, and in the end he settles on this semi-shiny paper that becomes this brand mark for Servet-i Fünun. Later on, at the turn of the century, the half-tone technology is introduced, where you basically take a projector, project the photograph through a grid, which has dots, piercings, and through those holes, the image is projected on a plate, chemically sensitized plate. So each dot, with its intensity, leaves its mark. This is more like offset printing. This is the most common pre-digital technology. But that kind of technology, the half-tone, the most advanced one, required a real shiny paper. And so this is what, by the 1910s, like there's this very prominent a new journal called Shehbal, which uses that extremely shiny paper. And it's just too much glare strikes your eye. So yeah, there's a whole other material world that concerns the use of the paper, and I think I should stop. Wait, I'm trying to go in order of raising hands. Adam was, I think, next.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I just wanted to ask you that this universe in the journal contain images which went through many, many hands.
Yes.
So at the moment when they are printed, they are seen, approved, perhaps also officially
Yeah.
by many individuals and perhaps also State Departments.
Yes,
So
definitely.
do you have examples of forbidden images or forbidden pamphlets
Mm-hmm.
or the legal base of forbidden images,
Mm-hmm.
either based on political arguments or on religious arguments?
Mhm.
Because this seems to me like a beautiful world of images, but a beautiful official world of images.
Mhm.
And I think that there were, of course, obscene images, caricatures also, but perhaps also photographs. At least
Mhm.
in Egypt, certainly there were.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Right.
I don't know.
No, definitely. This was a world that was under severe surveillance by the authorities. Like every week, the editor had to take all the what they call the formas, the typescripts, and go to the censor's office, and all of it had to be written and scratched, and then it had to be retyped or reorganized. Definitely, I mean, we're talking about the Hamidian era, and there's a whole, what I tried to mention as the journal establishment, espionage establishment, where, individuals, not necessarily spies, could sort of file their complaints to the palace, and there was a special telegraphy office instituted in the Yıldız Palace that would get these sort of reports, but also police reports that had these photographs. Most of the important journals were photographed and filed. There, we would probably have been able to trace many sort of instances of how images were banned and so forth, but unfortunately, there was an investigation after the Hamidian era, after the Young Turk Revolution, and there were about, if I'm not wrong, about 600 cases of journals that were cataloged and classified that the investigators had to go through, but then it created this havoc because everybody was in each other's throats because your name is there, no, my name is there, everybody's name was there. So in the end, in 1914, they burned almost entirely all of these documents. So that we are only able to catch the glimpses of from the writings of people who were in the investigation committee. But from my limited, so far very limited research in the archival department, what I have been able to find were several documents sent from the palace with the intention of monitoring the Sultan's image itself. And it seems, I mean, among all other Ottoman sultans of the photographic era, Abdülhamid is the least photographed. Because, frankly, I think because he didn't want to be sided with potatoes, that was one reason. So he never appeared in these journals. And whenever his name was, his image was taken, it was always in this very controlled, ceremonial, sterilized kind of atmosphere. And he sends these orders to different officials in different parts of the empire to use this image, not use that. If they're using it at a certain occasion, to tell him whether, what kind of occasion this is, whether it's appropriate or not, is being very, very strictly monitored. So there's definitely a very strong apparatus of control behind these operations. And, just one more point. I told you that the Malumat was sponsored by the palace, but all of these illustrated journals actually received state support from the Interior Ministry because Abdülhamid was very much interested in this power of the media. So he wanted to support them. Servet-i Fünun, for instance, wouldn't have survived with that kind of state support. It was connected to a publishing company. That's how it survived. But nevertheless, there was also support. I mean, so on the one hand,
Journals in the empire.
not in the empire, in Istanbul. So far as I can tell, as far as I could do my research, I can only talk about the Istanbul ones. The Hamidian panoptic system doesn't seem to work in a flawless manner in the provinces. I mean, after all, when the revolution started happening in Macedonia, it took 2 days for the palace to realize what was going on. So that's not, it wasn't perfect. And in terms of this whole monitoring and serious sort of surveillance of imagery. Nevertheless, I would still, let me show you one more image. I would still emphasize my point about the ambiguity of both photography and in the ways that it comes together with other forms of media. This is an image, for instance, was published in one of these journals of a bandit, Deli Ahmet, Crazy Ahmet, who was a partner of Çakırcalı, one of the greatest, most sort of celebrity, let's say, bandits in Anatolia. He was killed, Deli Ahmet, and his corpse, with all the paraphernalia, his pipe and everything, was photographed on the side of his father and his son and the officials. But when I look at this image, on the one hand, it's very humiliating to have your father, have a father next to his son's corpse. But at the same time, you have this sort of charge of the hero, bandit hero, that is basically evoked through the whole exotic costumes, the Zeybek kind of costumes of the dead man. So I think in terms of photography, once you have the photograph, there is no absolute sovereignty, there is no absolute control, because it's an analog transcription of reality, you see. So there's always this element of escape and open reading involved. Yes.
I have a follow-up question on David's question at the beginning. I also wasn't very clear about your thoughts on photography's status as a visual testimony. Because your comparison to the British magazines, that might be true for certain magazines, but I also think it doesn't work with others. For example, there's the graphic magazine,
Right.
where it's incredibly important
Right.
that this is exactly how the photograph looks like, and they would even tell the reader this is from a photograph.
Exactly.
And the
Right.
same applies for scientific journals as well. So you have these parallel worlds in
Right.
the periodical press, where sometimes it is very important to have stages of evidence in the photograph. Sometimes it doesn't matter at all. And that said, I felt like your material that showed the parallel use of drawings and photographs at the same time almost suggests that it wasn't always important, that it's more a matter of purpose and function of the image, whether this actually matters or whether it doesn't. So
Right.
I wasn't very clear about this. And related to this question is the question where you place your project in the historiography of photography at large. Because I appreciated your approach to get away from the binary, that two images that in fact look very similar shouldn't be considered as distinct only because they're from Western or a local photographer took the image. So I totally agree with that, but at the same time it suggests idiosyncrasy in other respects. And so I wasn't clear whether your attempt is to integrate Ottoman photography with modern existing Western historiography or whether you want to tease out what makes it different and what makes it special.
Right. Let me start from there. That's not my intention at all. Actually, actually talking here, I realized that over I think 3 times I made this. I was trying to make the case that the Ottoman sort of examples are different in terms of how they are engaged in intermediality and in terms of their technical qualities. And I realized that maybe I was pushing too far on that. My real, I think, interest is in reading this medium, the illustrated journal, in comparative perspective, in comparison, not only to the illustrated, the news and the graphic, but also to the sketch, for instance. That's a whole illustrated magazine that is, filled with these hand-drawn sketches, and try to understand not the Ottoman uniqueness particularly, but how this medium operates, okay? What are its kind of qualities in the way that it combines imagery and different kinds of imagery and text, but at the same time trying to sort of, no, let me put it this way. By departing from the Ottoman material itself, I hope and aim to arrive at certain sort of comparative insights about this particular medium, the illustrated journal, how it works. I'm not really that much interested in pointing out the boundaries, delineating the boundaries of Ottoman illustrated magazines, and there are particularities, obviously. And in connection to that, when I flip through the pages of all of these Ottoman journals and l'Illustration, Le Monde Illustré, Illustrated London News, it really does strike me that the number of images that have this photographic quality in the Ottoman examples by far exceeds anything you see in the Western European examples. That's a very, very strong impression. I'm not taking a step back there. Although they did, by the turn of the century, in increasing numbers, they did include half-tone, very photographic reproductions of photographs. Nevertheless, there is really this distinction between how you value the quality of the artist's work in a photographic reproduction. Okay? I think there is a definite difference there. In terms of the historiographic point, I think I have answered your question. Again, my real, I think, intention is to depart from the Ottoman material, not because it's Ottoman, but because it tells us something about broader connections and networks, and in the new global ways in which these new media worked. Okay, because the problem is like one of the articles by Wendy Shaw on Ottoman photography talks about how, because the Ottomans lacked a pictorial Western-style academic pictorial tradition, they had this very, she calls, innocent modernist look that is inadvertently subversive and very modern. And I find this to be very problematic, because I think the point is that photography in and of itself is revolutionary and new for the Ottomans as well as for the British and the French. We're talking about a new world. It's like talking about the digital revolution today. You see? So I'm trying to delineate the particularities and the historicized different aspects of that threshold, departing from the case of the Ottoman examples. Sibel, you've waited too long, yes.
So, I don't know if this is fair. I know as a historian you are focused on your own period up now,
Yes.
up to 1924, up to this. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts regarding this study of the illustrated journal in a slightly later period, because at least I have looked at a lot of the early Republican stuff, like Resimli Ay, Muhit,
Yes.
Yedidin, and you would expect that because when you reach the 1920s, 30s, there are of course new techniques and new representational developments in photography. I mean, there's collage, montage, doctoring of the image, and Bauhaus photography has started, etc. But what strikes me is how actually similar these popular illustrated magazines are to some of what you're showing us in terms of combining sketches with photographs, with documentary use, crime stories, city reportage, etc. Whereas it's only in La Turquie Kemalist that you find some of the, the really avant-garde photography techniques. So I was just thinking whether one can hypothesize the continuity of the representation of everyday modernity in these illustrated journals as opposed to more official publications that use photography.
Definitely, definitely. And
I guess what I'm doing is your comparative framework in looking at the illustrated journal, I'm sure, is very interesting in the context of 19th century Europe and Ottoman Empire, but also temporally.
I see.
Maybe looking at
Yeah.
slightly later developments.
Even more than slightly later. I mean,
Well,
you know,
you just mentioned the digital world.
yeah, because it
Absolutely,
keeps
yeah.
coming back
Yeah.
to one's mind when you're thinking about intermediality, as well as an interactive interface. I hate these terms, but these journals do seem to work in this very participatory, interactive manner. And by your period, actually, I think by the late 10s and early 1920s, you have these people basically sending their portrait photographs to be published at the back page of every article. This was the case when I was a kid. We had children's magazines. I sent my picture, and they would publish it, and you would see yourself there. It's like your YouTube kind of moment. So I think there is there is a good deal of continuity, and this is, I think it's appropriate. This is why it's appropriate to call this period the very beginnings, the incipient beginnings of the age of mass media. But again, in terms of differences, I think with the Ottoman case, you have a much less a less strong presence of the commercial aspect. You take an illustrated London News, and the last 5 pages are basically ads, whereas for the Ottoman journals for this period, it wasn't a real source of income. Yes, Dennis. Okay, I'll come to you.
Just a very, very brief
Yes.
question. Do you see any moment moving through these journals a kind of discussion, even brief ones, where photography is considered art
Oh, yeah.
and not, a method
Yeah.
of documentation
Uh-huh.
or something that suggests veracity? And does that happen in the 80s and 90s, or is that something that we should expect, later on?
It does happen. It does happen. Right from the very start, because these are basically, this is a kind of medium that takes its charge from photography, basically. And the editors state this very, very overtly, that, we are able to sell, and we are a new medium because there is photography involved. And so from the very first issues, and I'm talking about the 1890s, onwards, you have for instance, in the Servet-i Fünun, what they call the photograph conversations, photograph musahabeleri, where they take up this issue of, the ambiguity of photograph, both as a toy, sometimes they talk about it as a toy, as a scientific instrument, recording reality, but at the same time, a fine arts vehicle. And the sense that I got from surveying these conversations is that most authors have this tendency to talk about it as a very protean, multi-leveled instrument that allows for infinitely different modalities of usage, and that I found to be particularly interesting.
The competition that is going on, they choose a set of images.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really tell you why, why the one that has the little wins and not,
Yeah.
it gets the first place, and then, sort of ancient
Yeah.
photography gets the second. It seems like there's a sort of a genre forming with photography as well, but it's just never discussed in the way that one would hope to see.
No, yeah, maybe that would be too much. I mean, what you see is that with each issue, not only of Servet-i Fünun, there are photography competitions organized by almost all of these journals, and each and every journal has a section called Our Pictures, where they describe. These are also, I think, experiments in the description of visual material. And some of these do involve the snapshots. And it would be very interesting to go into the details of these narratives and see how they devise rhetorical strategies, aesthetic strategies for the discussion of these images. This is not only the case for photography, but also for the phonograph, about which there are many articles. The case of the human image and the human voice dissociated from the body. It's the ability to store that knowledge, okay? The ability to create a prosthesis instrument that basically records and carries it for good is something that fascinates people a lot. So there's a good deal of discussion about how the phonograph works, what it does to the voice. There's one author who writes in the Istanbul letters, in the city letters section. He complains about hearing a phonograph at each and every corner of his neighborhood, and the voice is terrible, and that it's destroying the sense of community that music creates. People getting together in their yallas in the afternoon and making music is completely being lost. So, yeah. Yes, Hashim. Okay.
There's a very beautiful tension in the story that you're telling between the idea of the photograph as a fragment and yet the idea of its orchestration, both inside, on the page, and within the journal itself. And as you were speaking and showing the images, it struck me that perhaps, as a kind of theoretical baggage that you brought at the beginning between Barth on the punctum and Benjamin on the production, both of them were also fascinated with the context of these photographs, which had to do more, if we talk about Barth, with the journal itself as a universe, and Benjamin with the panorama as another sound, which brought these fragments together in a very clever way. So I'm wondering if we can ask you more about the orchestration of these fragments, the very masterful orchestration of these fragments that brings them together on the page with other media, like the frame, like the text, but also in the issue itself. So shifting in a way the agency from the photographer to the art director and the editor.
That's right.
Because there's something masterful in the way that you're describing it about how they're able to keep it in suspense as a fragment that tells a larger story, as something that is at once current but able to have a longer shelf life, to be a vignette, but to be able to carry the smell of the whole Istanbul. It's a very beautiful play there. I don't know if it was crafted and deliberate that way.
Which one was it, I wonder? Oh. This one? No.
Elaborating on it, it's a bit like the images alone, but then when they were mounted on the albums, where the calligraphy and the pictures were put together, it's a whole different way of judging the juxtapositions and the sequences and so on. So in a way, I was thinking that your talk goes between sort of talking about medium and then, however, a lot of it is on content and subject matter as well. Maybe this, because it switched from photography to the journal, it's so I think this is a useful way of framing, because I think from the questions, where is the main sort of point of gravity is
I see.
for the
Okay.
listeners, because it's so rich, it's a universe. But maybe you will keep changing as you look at these things and what you might do.
Because there's no doubt in all of this, in the way you presented it, that these journals were the medium of the photograph, that they were carrying the photograph to other people. But the orchestration of that medium was a very deliberate one from what you're saying.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. I do agree that I need to put more thought in, how, as a mixed media kind of environment, these journals, the practicalities through which they actually mix these media and put them together is something that I definitely need to delve into in more detail.
Even in the Hamidian albums, like when you look at a photograph album, you expect to see a multitude of photographs, and all of a sudden you have an engraving, or you have a sketch.
Mm-hmm.
Especially
Yeah.
in the early ones in the 1880s.
Mm.
There is this sort of mixed media desire to sort of a mejmua of sorts of images that maybe later on they then sort of differentiate between media, but early on they actually take everything they can to illustrate whatever they're trying to illustrate.
Yeah, that's my intention framework of looking exactly. And even when the certain albums are dissociated as photograph albums, it's the case that they don't work as individual objects, but in conjunction with different kinds of media that come together in the archive, in the broader confines of the archive itself. So this is the kind of parallelism that I'm trying to draw in trying to understand a common mode of mediality that governs the use of imagery in these different contexts. And the journal is just one example.
We have tired you out, and thank
Okay.
you for this.
Thank you.